There are places in the Canadian Rockies that still appear on maps. They have names. Some even have coordinates. But if you actually go there, if you drive the gravel roads until they run out, and then keep walking, you won't find a town. You'll find walls with no roofs. You'll find rust where machines used to be. You'll find a child's chair sitting inside a house that hasn't had windows since before your grandparents were born. The Rockies are sold to the world as untouched wilderness. Eternal glaciers, sacred silence, peaks that look like they've never seen a human being. And that image is real, mostly. But hidden inside that landscape, slowly being consumed by spruce and snow and time, are the remains of communities that once held thousands of people. Schools, churches, newspapers, saloons, dreams. This isn't a video about adventure. It's about what happens when the most unforgiving geography on the continent decides to reclaim what was always its, and what's left when it's done. Because here's what becomes clear when you look at all of these places together. The abandonment wasn't quiet, it wasn't peaceful. In the Rockies, abandonment is active, sometimes violent, and almost always final. Start somewhere that feels manageable. Bankhead sits, or what remains of it sits, just outside the town of Banff. Close enough that tourists drive past the trailhead without knowing what they're missing. It was a coal mining operation, built by the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1903 to fuel the locomotives crossing the mountains. At its peak, nearly 1,000 people lived here. There were tennis courts, a curling rink, a reading room. The CPR shut it down in 1922, cheaper coal from other regions. The company dismantled the buildings they could use elsewhere and left the rest. What you find now walking that trail are concrete foundations half buried in grass, a few rusted machine parts, brick walls that stop at knee height. The forest has been working on it for over 100 years. What lingers about Bankhead isn't the scale of the loss. It's the proximity. This isn't deep wilderness. You're 20 minutes from a resort town, and yet the place feels genuinely erased. The CPR took the roofs and the windows and anything useful, and time took everything else, except the foundations. Those stay. They always stay. A few kilometers from Bankhead, even closer to Banff, there's a spot where a different coal town was meant to exist. Anthracite, except it barely got started before it was over. Mining began in the mid-1880s. The coal was there, good quality, viable deposits. But the operation was plagued from the start. The seams were difficult, labor was unstable. By 1904 it was done. The whole thing lasted about 15 years, which sounds like a reasonable run, until you realize those 15 years weren't enough to finish building the town they'd planned. There's something specific about a place that was abandoned before it was completed. Bankhead had a curling rink. Anthracite barely had time to become itself. What remains is less defined. Scattered remnants, some earthworks, fragments that don't quite tell a coherent story because the story never got to a coherent point. It's like finding the rough draft of a town. All the intention, none of the follow-through. And the mountains around it look exactly the same as they did when the first miners arrived. In the Kootenays region of BC, where several mining districts converged in the 1890s, Three Forks existed for one reason. It was in the middle of everything. It served the mines at Sandon, at Kootenays, at other camps spread through those narrow valleys. Warehouses, hotels, supply operations. The kind of place that doesn't produce anything itself, but makes everything around it possible. When the mines began closing, some exhausted, some just economically unviable, Three Forks lost its reason to exist. Not because of any single disaster, but because the whole system it served quietly stopped needing it. The population drained away through the 1900s and into the 1910s. By the time anyone thought to document what had been there, most of it was already gone. That kind of ending is its own particular thing. No explosion, no flood, no dramatic final moment. Just a slow withdrawal, like the tide going out and not coming back. The buildings rotted or burned or were salvaged for lumber. What Three Forks became is essentially nothing. Not ruins, just absence. A cleared space where a town used to think it had a future. Called the Paris of the Kootenays. That's not promotional language. People genuinely called it that. By the late 1890s, Sandon had electric lights, running water, multiple hotels, a red light district, and more than 24 saloons serving a population pushing 5,000. It was one of the most sophisticated urban centers west of Calgary, deep in a mountain valley, surrounded by peaks that received 12 meters of snow in a bad winter. The silver crash of 1900 hit hard. Then a fire destroyed most of the commercial district. The town rebuilt. People came back. Then another flood tore through in 1955. The creek that runs through the valley swelled after a major snowmelt and took out most of what remained. After the second disaster, the rebuilding didn't happen. The few dozen people who were still there simply left. What survived the fires and the floods, a handful of structures, a city hall foundation, sits there now in a valley that gets almost no sun in winter. You can still find the old water system, some wooden boardwalk planks. The creek still runs exactly where it always ran, indifferent to what it has done twice to the same place. There's something about Sandon that refuses to feel like an accident. 2 floods, 2 chances to leave. The second time, they took the hint. Silver was found in the Arrow Lakes region in the late 1880s, and Galena was one of the camps that grew up around it fast, too fast for anyone to think carefully about infrastructure or longevity. The ore looked promising. A town site was surveyed. Businesses opened. People moved their families in. But the high-grade deposits ran out before the town could root itself properly. The mines that were supposed to sustain the community played out within a few years. And unlike Sandon, which had enough momentum to survive one disaster and rebuild, Galena never had that depth. When the easy ore was gone, the money left, and then the people left, and then there was nothing particularly left to leave. What makes Galena worth remembering isn't its size or its drama. It's how quickly the whole cycle ran. Arrival, hope, extraction, departure, inside of a decade. The Rockies have dozens of these micro-histories, these places that barely registered before they were already becoming memory. Galena is one of the cleaner examples of how fast that cycle could move when the geology didn't cooperate. Not all of these places were born from mining. Briscoe in the Columbia Valley was an agricultural settlement, a community that grew up around farming and small commerce, tied to roots that once made sense. The Columbia River gave access. The land was workable. For a few decades in the early 20th century, families built here with the expectation that they were building something lasting. Then the roads changed. The rail lines were routed differently. The commerce that had passed through Briscoe started passing somewhere else instead. These things happen gradually, the way a river shifts course. Not all at once, but steadily, until one day the water is somewhere else entirely, and the old channel is just a dry depression in the ground. The forest closed in over decades. What had been cleared land for farming is now mature spruce and fir. The community structures decayed or were demolished. A few old-timers stayed until they couldn't anymore. Briscoe is a reminder that you don't need a mine collapse or a natural disaster to lose a town. Sometimes all it takes is being on the wrong side of a road that gets rerouted. The geography didn't change. The human logic did. Here's where the scale starts to shift. Nordegg wasn't a camp. It was a genuine planned community. Company town, yes, but thoughtfully built. By the 1920s, it held nearly 3,000 people. There was a hospital, a school, a sports complex. The coal seams beneath it were among the most productive in the foothills. This place was meant to last generations. The mine closed in 1955. Not because the coal ran out, there's still coal down there, but because demand shifted. Natural gas was cheaper. The economics stopped making sense. Over the following years, almost everyone left. The company houses were vacated one by one. The hospital closed. The sports complex fell quiet. Today, Nordegg has a permanent population of under 100 people, but the infrastructure of a 3,000-person town is still partially there. You can walk streets that were designed for a community that no longer exists. Buildings that were meant to serve thousands now serve almost no one. The scale of the vacancy is what gets you. Not just an abandoned building or two, but an entire urban layout, designed with care, emptied out. The mine structures are a provincial historic site now. Guided tours run in summer, which means there are people carefully preserving the memory of a place that was cleared out within living memory. That particular combination, active preservation, near total depopulation, is its own kind of haunting. This one takes a moment to understand fully. Lille was a French-Canadian coal town in the Crousnest Pass, established in 1901 by a company with French investors. The workers who came were largely francophone. They built a town with its own cultural identity, Catholic Church, French language community, specific traditions brought from Quebec and from France itself. An entirely distinct social world planted in the Alberta foothills. The mine closed in 1912. The population scattered. The buildings were dismantled or collapsed. The language disappeared from the valley. The cultural identity that had been carefully established over those 11 years, gone, as completely as if it had never existed. What remains of Lille are the coke ovens, enormous beehive-shaped stone structures built to process the coal now standing alone in a clearing. They're almost perfectly intact. They'll likely outlast everything else in the pass. But nobody who built them, nobody who spoke French in that valley, nobody who attended that church, none of that culture left any lasting mark on the place. The stone survived, the people did not. There's something deeply unsettling about the specific things that manage to persist. The records on this one are incomplete. That's the first thing you need to know. Fish Lake Settlement was a small farming and trapping community in the BC interior, isolated enough that it didn't generate much documentation, and whatever documentation existed wasn't carefully preserved. The last residents left sometime in the 1950s, but the question, the one that keeps coming up when you look into this, is why? The official record doesn't give a clear answer. There's no mine closure to point to, no flood, no disaster that shows up in the archives. The people simply stopped being there. The settlement was present in early aerial surveys. Then it wasn't. Isolation of that kind can break communities without any dramatic cause. A harsh winter. A family decision that once made makes the next family reconsider. A loss of critical mass. When the teacher leaves, the children need schooling elsewhere. When the children leave, the parents follow. But those processes usually leave some paper trail, some record of the decision-making. Here, there's near silence. The settlement dissolves into the historical record the same way it dissolved into the landscape, quietly, without leaving much to explain it. Canmore is one of the strangest cases in this whole list, because the town of Canmore didn't die. It became a resort community, one of the most desirable real estate markets in Western Canada. But the mining infrastructure that the town was built around sits inside the boundary of what is now Kananaskis country, partially protected, partially deteriorating. The Canmore Coal Company operated here from the 1880s until 1979, nearly a century of extraction. The mine buildings that remain, ventilation structures, headframes, various outbuildings, exist in a strange bureaucratic limbo. They're heritage structures, technically protected. But the protection is complicated by their location within a recreation area that attracts millions of visitors who are there for the mountains, not the industrial ruins beside them. What makes this unsettling isn't abandonment in the traditional sense. It's the juxtaposition. A few kilometers from condominiums selling for $2 million, inside a national park boundary, the remains of a coal operation that ran for nearly 100 years are slowly losing the fight against moisture and gravity. The tourists drive past on their way to hiking trails, the structures decay, and the mountain that the miners bored into for a century shows no sign of whatever they took from it. There are camps in the Canadian Rockies that were never officially registered. Mining operations at elevation, above 2,000 meters, sometimes above 2,400, that existed seasonally, that moved with the snow, that were worked by men who didn't necessarily have paperwork establishing they were there at all. Some of these camps appear in period photographs. A few are mentioned obliquely in company ledgers. Most of them have no consolidated name in the historical record. There is one site, referenced by a small number of backcountry guides and discussed in regional history circles without ever reaching formal documentation, that sits at over 2,400 meters in a location that requires multiple days of difficult hiking to reach. Wooden structures are still standing, not ruins in the conventional sense, standing. The altitude and the cold have preserved them in a way that the lower elevation sites were never preserved. Timbers that should have rotted 100 years ago are still structurally sound. The guides who know this place don't encourage overnight camping there. The reasons given are practical. Weather comes in without warning at that elevation. Routes become dangerous in sudden snowfall. But there's something else in how they describe it. A quality of disorientation. The sense of being inside something that isn't finished, that was abandoned mid-thought. Tools still positioned as if someone was working. A space that feels occupied in a way that the absence of people doesn't fully explain. No one has formally catalogued what's there. No heritage designation exists. The mountain holds it, and the mountain doesn't explain why. April 29th, 1903, 4:31 in the morning. Turtle Mountain, which had been giving signs for months that something was wrong. Sounds in the rock, small shifts, local miners who'd been calling it the mountain that walks, finally moved. 90 million tons of limestone broke from the summit and came down in 90 seconds. The debris field covered 3 square kilometers. The speed of the slide was estimated at over 100 kilometers an hour. The sound was heard 40 kilometers away. The town of Frank, Alberta, a coal mining community of about 600 people, was directly in the path. The eastern portion of town was buried. Between 70 and 90 people died. The exact number has never been established, because some victims were never recovered. They are still there, under the rock. The slide debris field is still there too, covering the valley floor. Boulders the size of houses scattered across what used to be streets and homes and a river. The Crow's Nest River was temporarily dammed by the debris. The CPR railway was buried under 30 meters of rock. What makes Frank different from every other place on this list is that it wasn't abandoned. The western half of the town survived. People kept living there, kept working the mine, in fact, for several more years. The community continued alongside the fresh grave of its eastern half. Children grew up in Frank, who had never known it any other way. The slide was just part of the landscape the way the mountains were part of the landscape. You can go there now. The Frank Slide Interpretive Center sits at the edge of the debris field and does an honest, careful job of telling the story. Buses come, school trips, families on vacation from Calgary who pull off the highway because the boulder field is so obviously enormous that you can't not stop. And standing at the edge of it, looking at those rocks, knowing that under some of them are the remains of people who never got to leave, who never got a choice. The standard vocabulary of tragedy doesn't quite fit. This wasn't a mine closing, wasn't an economic decision, wasn't a flood that gave 2 or 3 warnings before it hit. It was a mountain that decided, in 90 seconds, that the arrangement was over, and nothing anyone did or could have done was going to change that. The miners had called it the mountain that walks. They weren't wrong. It just didn't walk slowly enough for anyone to get clear in time. What you're left with after all of this is a feeling that's hard to put words to. Not quite grief, not quite awe, something in between. Every single one of these places was built by people who intended to stay. They brought their families. They built churches and schools and curling rinks. They named the streets. They set up newspapers and elected local officials and argued about things that mattered in that moment. They had every reason to believe they were building something permanent, and the Rockies let them believe that. For a while. Long enough for the belief to harden into certainty. Then the seam ran dry, or the company left, or the flood came, or the mountain moved. And everything those communities had built was revealed to be exactly what it always was. Temporary occupation in a landscape that operates on a completely different timescale than human ambition. Somewhere right now, there's a wooden structure still standing at 2,400 meters that nobody has officially named. The wind is moving through it the same way it moved through it 100 years ago. There are tools inside, positioned the same way they were left. And the mountain around it is doing what it always does. Indifferent, patient, present in a way that makes a human lifespan feel like a very brief visit. They came, they built, they left. The mountain is still there,